Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for making some time on this Sunday evening to come to this public lecture. My name's David Stephen. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre on International Cooperation, which is part of NYU. And we are here, a group of us are here in Abu Dhabi, kindly hosted by the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute to take part in a seminar entitled Powering the Next Century, Geopolitics and Cross-Cutting Challenges in the Governance of Strategic Resources. So we're basically looking at energy, at food, at water, at climate change, and trying to understand how these are going to change geopolitics in the future and what kind of governance arrangements we need to respond to those challenges. This is the fourth in the series of these seminars, again, kindly hosted here in Abu Dhabi, and hopefully we will continue to come in subsequent years as we look at other foreign policy challenges. Tonight, we're very honoured to have John Ashton with us. Now, John is one of the few people that I can pinpoint the precise day, the precise moment that I met him. I'm not sure whether John actually will remember this, but on September the 11th, 2001, I was on a flight that left Boston at about 8:15 in the morning, and as a result, I was one of the last people to know that the Twin Towers had been hit that day, because we were in the air all through the day, flying across the transatlantic. Our plane, rather unfortunately, listed as missing, and it wasn't until we landed not in London but in Wales and were met off the plane by the police that we knew that something extraordinary had happened that day. Later on that night, or in the middle of the night, we were flown eventually to London, and eventually, quite late, I got home. And the next day, I was due for an early meeting in the Foreign Office. Now, I assumed that Whitehall would be completely locked down and nobody would be coming in or going out. But I felt I should at least try and get to this meeting. And not a bit of it. You somewhat forget how much security has changed. Those were the days, even on that particular day, when you could just walk straight into the Foreign Office without even anybody looking inside your bag. And I was soon ushered up to a small room where John and a group of his colleagues was waiting for me to talk about climate change and diplomacy. I remember that John made a short speech that day. At the beginning of the meeting, he said that after 9/11, the world would never be the same, that the practice of foreign policy would be changed forever, but the kinds of transnational issues that he was working on would become more important and not less. Now, John has a distinguished record as a diplomat, and I think he's had the knack of always being on the cutting edge of the issues that he has addressed. He was in Italy during the Tangentopoli corruption scandal, so called because a pot of money in Italy flows through the system, and everybody at a tangent cuts their little slice off it. When he was in Italy, he wrote a study of the mafia, and he made the case that the mafia and organised crime would become core foreign policy issues. I think this was quite forward-thinking at the time and is now considered quite normal. He then went to Hong Kong and was the right-hand man of Chris Patton as the British flag was lowered over Hong Kong and it was handed back to Chinese sovereignty. And after that, he came back to London, and this is when or the period in which I first knew him. He took over what would become the Environment Policy Department within the Foreign Office, within King Charles Street in London. Now, the late 1990s was an enormously busy time for a global environment policy. The Kyoto Protocol was agreed in 1997, just before John took up the job, I believe. But that just started a fraught process of trying to work out what the protocol actually meant, and also trying to get sufficient governments to countries to ratify it, that it could come into force, as it did in 2000, or as it crossed the line in 2002 to come into force 3 years later. We also saw the World Summit on Sustainable Development in that period in 2002, and there were an intensive agenda on a number of issues, such as biodiversity. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this work was mostly about formal negotiations. At the Foreign Office, John was part of a bold attempt to get governments to interact with each other in ways that would make it possible for them to address transboundary environmental challenges. He also began the process of reaching past governments to understand the broader domestic economic and social drivers that determine what a government is able to do internationally. And he also fought the good fight within our own system, trying to get disparate ministries to work together, and that's probably the hardest task of all. Finally, he built a very different diplomatic team, a team that had people from NGOs, people on secondment from business, people even from other countries. And he started the work of building a global network across Britain's embassies and other diplomatic missions. All of this actually rather ruined foreign policy for me, because I came to the conclusion that this is how diplomacy was done. And when I worked with other bits of the Foreign Service, I found that it was a rather different world. It was like going from a Japanese bullet train to the clapped-out infrastructure, the clapped-out trains that take us into work in London every day. Now, John clung on to this environment job for a long time, I suspect rather longer than the office wanted, because they would be waiting to cycle him off to be a diplomat, to be an ambassador somewhere around the world. But when the time finally came, he didn't move on in the Foreign Service, but he left government to set up E3G, an environmental organisation that would work for a global transition to sustainable development in a new generational way, in a third generational way. Now, usually once you've gone from government, that's it, you don't come back in. But he re-emerged 4 years later as a political appointee, with a role that was partly a political appointee and partly a civil servant, and he became the Foreign Secretary's Special Envoy on climate change, a job that he served in for, I think, 6 years, working alongside 3 foreign secretaries. And even though he was a political appointee, alongside both a Labour government and a Conservative-led coalition. He finally left government last year, this time for good, I think, but one never knows, and will, among other topics, be telling us tonight about the new routes that he's taking to try and make it politically possible to build a low-carbon future. So, ladies and gentlemen, John Ashton. Now, as I've suggested, John, you know, you've worked on climate change now for 15 years or so, and you must have seen really quite significant changes in the way that the issue is dealt with, in the way that governments treat it, and in the scale of the problem that we have before us. So I wondered if you could start by just giving us a reflection on what you think has changed and why.
I will, but before I do that, can I just say how thrilled I am to be here in Abu Dhabi. It's my first time here, and a place which has been a beacon of the sort of attempt to make a transition to a new energy economy in a region where some of the forces on either side of that sort of tension between the old and the new are quite complicated. But I think the role that Abu Dhabi is playing, for example, as host of IRENA is very positive, and it's wonderful to be here, so thank you. I mean, I think, can I start by identifying something that hasn't changed, first of all, which is that 15 years ago we hadn't really begun to drive the real transition from a high-carbon economy to a low-carbon economy, and we still haven't really begun. We're still locking in the high-carbon business-as-usual pattern of production and consumption much faster collectively as a world than we're building the pathway to the new model of production and consumption. Having said that, some things have changed, and they're quite important. I think one of them is that in all kinds of ways, there's now much more of a tangible sense than there was back in those days that you were talking about, that business as usual, whatever that means, has reached the end of its useful life. And it's a bit, you have to look quite hard to understand that, because actually there are, if you just listen to what is coming out of establishments, you do get a bit of that, but you also get a lot of signs that some people are still clinging very desperately to business as usual in the hope that it will all be okay. But as soon as you go beyond establishments, as I've now, in my new life, I spend a lot of time going up and down my own country and just trying to listen to the views of different kinds of people, and particularly young people, actually. And it's very clear to them. I mean, I think 9/11 was one landmark there, but of course 2008 was another one. And they don't all articulate it in the same way. They won't all give you a kind of rigorous PhD level of analysis behind it. It's an emotional sense that something fundamental has gone wrong, something fundamental has to be fixed. And part of that actually is a sense, I think this is arguably as significant as any political fact in the world today, the sense among people who are sort of in between the ages of 20 and 30 that you find in Britain, you find widespread across Europe, but you find in many other places as well, that they are the first generation for a very long time who, as they look at the future, see a prospect which is not necessarily as attractive, probably less attractive than the prospect that their parents saw when they were their age. And that's, in a sense, it's worrying. It's a factor for instability because it's not that intergenerational conversation that needs to be built to address that, hasn't been built yet. But it's also an opportunity because at the heart of that intergenerational conversation is the opportunity to mobilize new political energy for the transformation that's required if we construct the conversation in the right way. There's a warning there, because if we don't construct the conversation in the right way, then a space opens up. And into that space, history tells us you get populists, you get demagogues, you get false prophets, you get Pied Pipers, and they offer an illusion of simplicity in a complex world that can't really deliver. So the challenge is for the establishments to get back on the case and offer something better. And just final point, I mean, it's pretty obvious to people of that generation that if you want to build a credible intergenerational settlement, if it doesn't include a serious response to climate change, then it won't be a credible settlement and they won't sign up to it.
Before we burrow in a bit more detail to this new political energy and these new directions, can you say how you explain to people what destination we should be heading in, how you articulate what the future should look like?
I don't think there's a single glib response to that, because I think the answer, I mean, all politics, it's a political question, and all politics is local. And the answer, if you're talking to people who live in the East End of Glasgow, where I was a little while ago, the answer to them is rather different to the answer you might give if you're in, I don't know, a university in New York or a rural community in Malawi or whatever. You have to locate these problems inside different cultural and political realities in a way that is inspiring and compelling for the people you're trying to build a conversation with. Having said that, I mean, I think there is one issue that's right at the center of it, and that's the nature of the growth model, or the development model, as you might call it in some places. We constructed, and it served us very well for quite a long time, a growth model which was essentially a high-carbon, resource-intensive model that didn't pay an enormous amount of attention to resilience, that wasn't too concerned about the consequences of shocks. And I think what we've discovered over the last 10, 15 years is that we need a growth model which is low carbon, and actually an energy system which is effectively carbon neutral within a generation or so, which is very resource efficient, and which pays a lot more attention, which has a lot more built-in resilience to shocks, because we now are beginning to understand that we face more shocks and more intense shocks than we have been used to in the past. That's a consequence of growing interdependence, the condition, whether we like it or not, the condition which now defines this age, and the rising demand pressures from an increasingly affluent middle class, or people escaping from poverty around the world. We can accommodate those, but we certainly can't accommodate them within the conventional growth model.
Okay, so let's stick on destinations for the moment, and you give that two parts: an effectively carbon neutral economy or society in a generation, and the resilience question. Explain to me what it means to build a carbon neutral society in a generation. What do we have to do to make that happen?
I'm gonna offer you an equation, David. I don't know whether you remember. Before I was a diplomat, I'm a fully weaponized mathematician. So this may sound a bit odd, but I want you to bear with me. Okay? The equation is 4 + 1 = 2.
Okay.
Okay, bear with me.
And
you may think 4 + 1,
yeah.
you may think it's not 2, but this is just a kind of little kind of rhetorical device, really. What does a carbon neutral energy system look like? I think we sometimes overcomplicate the challenge. What do we need to do? Well, we need to get carbon emissions out of the electricity system. You can't have a transition that doesn't do that in a generation or so. So that's basically coal and gas. You either stop burning coal and gas, or you bury the carbon emissions using what's called carbon capture and storage, which is available. It's not cheap, but it's available. One or two of those, one or other of those things. That's one. Number two, you need to get carbon emissions out of the transport system, which means, in practice, almost certainly running transport on electricity and on decarbonized electricity rather than on liquid hydrocarbon fuels. Not tomorrow, not next week, but over the course of a generation, we need to arrive there. Number three, and particularly prevalent in countries like ours in the winter, heating, space heating in buildings. Most of our heating in Britain and in many other countries is gas-fired space heating. You can't do carbon capture and storage on millions of gas-fired boilers, so you have to get out of gas for heating, and again, it's electrification. Number four, this is the 4 of the 4 + 1. Number 4 it's actually quite a small subset of the economy proportionately, but nevertheless a very important subset. There are lots of jobs in it and lots of sort of national prestige in it. Those industrial processes that are inherently carbon intensive. So the metallurgical processes, petrochemicals, steel and cement, petrochemicals for plastic, a lot of those rely on the reduction of oxidized minerals or chemical. You can't do it in a non-carbon intensive way, or at least not easily. The only way of moving that onto a carbon neutral footing is with carbon capture and storage. By the way, I'm not sort of setting these out, suggesting that they're in any way easy. There are plenty of people who would just say that doing that in a generation in any one of those areas is impossible. And at the moment, they can cite more evidence than somebody who says that actually we can do this without kind of breaking our stride. So anyway, those are the 4. What's the +1? Well, those are essentially supply-side interventions. On the demand side, we know that we use energy in all its forms a lot less efficiently than we could. And we can make this transition happen faster and in a less destabilizing way and more cheaply if at the same time we're acting on the demand side. Why is that equal to 2? You've probably guessed. The governments around the world again and again have stated that they think that the threshold within which we need to keep climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is 2 degrees of climate change. That beyond that becomes unmanageable climate change. It's a threshold, not a goal in my view. But the more we know about the science of climate change, the more it seems the best, if you're going to draw the line somewhere else, you probably need to draw it in a more ambitious side of 2 degrees rather than less ambitious. So to have a fighting chance of that, keeping within 2 degrees, you need to do those 4 + 1 things.
So without, let's take that as a given, and you add the resilience side onto that as well. Let's turn to the politics of the question. I mean, you have just said that all politics is local. Climate change is inherently a global problem. We have one atmosphere. The CO2 emitted anywhere ends up ultimately in the same place. So how do you? And we have a global politics as well. We're influenced by what people in other countries are doing, very much so. So how do you tie together this global level and this local level and begin to build a synergy between the two rather than seeing
it's a key question because I think that we haven't really begun to do that tying together to the extent that we need to if we're going to have a chance of success. There are a number of people in this room, I suspect, who, like me, had the experience of attending the climate conference in Copenhagen in 2000. Maybe, can you put your hand up if you were at Copenhagen, everybody? There's a few of us seasoned campaigners. So you will all have, I think, very rich and intense memories of that experience. I mean, there was a huge amount of debate afterwards about why it didn't go better than it did. But I think actually you can boil down the fundamental political problem to two really quite simple ideas. One is that not enough of the principles, if you like, the leaders who were being called upon to make promises to each other felt attracted enough to the idea of the low-carbon economy, the low-carbon growth model. To too many of them, it felt more like a risk than an opportunity. You know, I'm going to go home and I'm going to have to tell people that I've taken a risk with their jobs, their economic security, the competitiveness of our economy, the growth in our economy. So there was a kind of risk aversion that was to some extent. And then at the same time, on the sort of other side of the climate vice, if you like, I think there was already then a recognition that if we don't deal with climate change, then on the whole that will make the world a less secure place. But I think it was more an intellectual recognition than a political recognition. And it was, in a sense, seen as something that would happen tomorrow rather than something that might happen today. It wasn't a clear and present danger. And I suspect, I mean, there are people in this room who have held high elected office, and I haven't, so I sort of hesitate to really pontificate about politics. But my sense as an observer is that in politics, there's today and tomorrow never comes. If it doesn't feel like a clear and present danger, then you know, you've got a much harder job on your hands. So that question about the tying together is really a question about how you make those two factors come into play in a much more tangible way in the minds of leaders and their advisors in governments when governments come back to the point of having to make promises to each other again. And I think we're at a very important moment in that cycle, because I think for a number of years we were in, if you like, the post-Copenhagen phase of this. I don't think anymore I think we're now in the pre-Paris phase, and you can sort of
explain what Paris is.
Well, Paris is the meeting that will take the UN process works on an annual cycle, and at the end of each year, usually November or December or straddling, there is the annual so-called Conference of Parties. In the jargon, it's the COP, Conference of Parties, and because of the rhythm that has now been built into that process, there is a commitment to come to a new agreement that will govern what governments do from the year 2020 onwards, but to reach that agreement in 2015 when the annual meeting is going to take place in Paris. And it will be preceded next year by a summit in New York that the UN Secretary General has already announced that he's going to convene, which I think will be in September of next year. And that's quite an interesting moment, because if you think about it, that will be the first time that global leaders will have assembled in public to talk about climate change since Copenhagen. So I think whether we like it or not, we're now at the beginning of a new cycle where we have to, as it were, try harder to get that interconnection between the domestic and the international
and
established.
You've chosen this moment in the cycle to focus much more of your attentions on UK politics than you ever have before. Why do you think that's important?
It's funny. I mean, again, in the room there are probably quite a lot of current or former diplomats. And when you're a diplomat, you get used to living in other countries or traveling to other countries and trying to understand what are the forces shaping those countries. But oddly enough, because you spend all your time doing that, you end up with a fairly superficial understanding of what's going on in your own. I think it's a kind of what the French call it, a déformation professionnelle of being a diplomat. But it's just seemed to me that at this moment it was quite important for me to try and get, if I'm going to go around pontificating about why this is really all a question of politics, and you have to connect this to domestic political drivers, I just want to get a better personal understanding of how some of those drivers work and what are the kinds of conversations you can build with different communities in your own country that will give them the feeling that this is the right direction for us to be going in as a country. So you're right.
And you've identified our failure as a failure to build a conversation, as you've said, around values. What do you mean by this conversation around values on climate change?
That's interesting. You've obviously been studying my previous utterances. I can't remember saying. I mean, there is a question of value. I mean, I would just frame it slightly differently. I think it was Brent Scowcroft when he was the U.S. National Security Advisor who said, he's not the only person to have said it, but I remember hearing him say that climate change is an existential problem. I mean, of course it's a problem about what we need to do, but in a sense it's also a problem about who we are, how we construct our identity, our sense of who we are in the world as individuals and societies. And so we need to be building a kind of alignment across different societies so that sense of who we are can accommodate the level of ambition that we need to achieve in what we can do. There is, of course, you're absolutely right. You can't separate that from values because it raises a question, for example, of accountability. I often think, I mean, we've had over the years a conversation about what we call sustainable development. And I've always thought it's intellectually, it's sort of the right conversation to have, but politically it's never really come to life to the extent that it should have. And I'm not sure that we've captured it in all of its dimensions. One dimension of it is that a consequence of that interdependence is that the choices that any of us make all of a sudden have a bigger impact on the lives of people that they will never meet on the other side of the world. And because we live in a single media space now as well, perceptions of that impact are also much stronger than they ever were. And that raises a question about who do we hold ourselves accountable to all of a sudden? The old nation of sovereignty that is constructed from the inside, that each nation state can sort of take refuge within. I mean, we can cling to it if we like, but if we do, we'll find that our governments and our other sort of forces in our societies increasingly fail to deliver the outcomes that people are looking for: food, water, and energy security, for example. And so we need to be open to the idea that accountability suddenly becomes a broader concept. And of course, accountability, responsibility for the consequences of your actions, links very deeply into values. There's a very, very specific aspect of that in the case of climate change, which is that those who are, if you like, on the leading edge of enduring the consequences of climate insecurity, on the whole, you can already see it. You can see the sort of early stages of it around the world, are precisely those people who have themselves done the least to make this a problem because they actually live very low carbon lives, in many of them in the poorest countries. And at the same time, they're the people who have the least capacity to deal with those consequences. So many people would criticize this for being a sort of idealistic view of how the world should work. I happen to cleave to it myself. But, if we want to be able to say that there is an ethical dimension to foreign policy, to take a phrase which has been used in our politics, then we need to recognize that fundamentally unethical aspect of climate change, in its current condition, and do something about it. By the way, when leaders go to that summit in next year and then the one in Paris, none of them is going to be willing to go home and say to their people that they've signed up to an unfair deal. The trouble is fairness feels different.
Well, I'm going to open it up to the floor, so get ready with your questions. But I want to bring it back to the international picture and this question of fairness. We I think we started off in 1992 with a fairly simple view of climate politics. There were developed countries and there were developing countries, and there was a need for some kind of bargain and deal between the two. Now we have extremely poor countries and people who emit basically nothing. We have emerging economies like India who emit a bit. We have countries like China whose emissions on a per capita basis are now beginning to become equal to the EU's, and then we have countries like the US, Australia, who are much higher. And then we have a whole series of demographic, of economic, of political factors that means that each of these blocks of countries are pulled in quite different directions. So how do you go about trying to get these countries to come together and agree on a common vision of what fairness looks like?
I mean, a couple of observations, and I'm looking forward to the broader discussion. But I think one thing is, and this is another of the things that has changed actually since those earlier years. The low carbon economy, the low carbon growth model, at that time was a fairly abstract concept. You know, there were people like me going around saying, actually, you know, we can do this in a way which is not going to be unduly damaging to jobs and growth and competitiveness. But you couldn't actually see it taking shape anywhere. Now, you can see it taking shape. And if you look, for example, I mean, there are a number of examples, but I think in many ways, some of the strongest impulses in building the low-carbon economy anywhere in the world right now are in China. I think what's happening in China, you've got the high-carbon economy and the low-carbon economy sort of side by side. But, you know, under the current 5-year plan in China, there are colleagues here who will correct me if this number is wrong, but I think the commitment was to invest $1.6 trillion over the 5-year period in 7 strategic industries. At least 4 of them are central to the low-carbon economy. The investment in renewable energy technologies and the market growth, the growth in scale of deployment in China alone has been the major factor in driving the unit cost of those technologies down their cost curves much faster than anybody would have predicted. You know, if you'd asked them 5 years ago what the unit costs would be. There have been studies by Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others that sort of illustrate that. But you can see some very significant aspects of the low-carbon economy in China. You can see it in Germany, to give another example. There are periods now in Germany, I'm told by German colleagues, where when demand is not particularly high and the right conditions, that the electricity being generated by solar and wind and hydro, but increasingly solar and wind, is more than 100% of domestic demand. And there are whole 24-hour periods now where the total proportion has exceeded 60%. To such an extent that there are now reports coming out of the investment community. There's a big report by Citibank recently, and I think there was something in The Economist as well, that they've started to notice that renewable energy is no longer marginal. It's driving structural change. It's threatening the established business model of some of the big fossil-based utilities. And this is disruptive. It's going to be really difficult to deal with, and it's causing stresses in Germany. But actually, I'd be more worried if you couldn't see any disruption of that kind, because that would sort of tell you that we were less further on.
I think it's another good example of the two economies, because Germany's on the one hand using much more renewables, but it's also using more coal at the same time, so the two economies are jostling
it's
against
true,
each other.
but don't confuse the sort of daily up and down, the noise from the signal, the structural signal.
Yeah.
The growth of renewables in Germany is a structural signal.
Yeah.
The relative balance between coal and gas is actually more of the noise, I think.
You have not touched upon overpopulation. Many of the poor countries still have birth rates that are very, very much higher than the middle class affluent societies. And they have at least five generations on 100 years, whereas in the rich countries, we had 3 generations. And if we just, in the rich countries, have 2 children, and in the poor countries they have 6, I mean, what can we do that will set that off?
Okay. John, do you want to quickly come on that one? Who wants to ask the next question as well? Yeah, big guy.
Just very quickly, I mean, it's a question that comes up again and again, and I always feel quite, what's the word, cautious about it, because I think that, I mean, there are lots of areas where one should be wary of sounding as if you're lecturing other societies and other cultures about choices that are really for them. Actually, energy technology is another one, but there is none more sensitive in that context than population. But I would say one other thing, which I think is really quite important to understand. The issue, the footprint, if you like, on not just climate, but the resource footprint overall, the ecological footprint, to some extent is a function of population, but to a much, much larger extent, to an extent which is an order of magnitude larger, it's a function of the growth model and the pattern of affluence, the carbon and resource footprint that arises from affluence. So you can't say to people, I think, you know, we're affluent, but you have to accept less affluence. You just, you know, that's not a kind of moral thing to say apart from anything else. What you can say is let's build a global conversation about how to shift the structure of the economy so that we can have the affluence without the footprint. And what we know is that in terms of technology, in terms of capital availability, that is a doable thing. The issue, if it turns out not to be doable, it will be because we haven't summoned the political will and the political imagination to overcome the political obstacles. And that is, if you like, orthogonal, to use a mathematical word, to the question, just to prove I'm a professional mathematician. It's orthogonal to the question of population, but it's the bigger question, it seems to me.
I think this question also comes into relief when you look at a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is now projected to have around 850 million people by the end of the century, which is an extraordinary increase. I think it's, well, it's less than 200 now. But the population growth is in the very poorest areas of the country. Around Lagos, where there's very strong economic growth, we're down to really quite small families. In the north, which is not developed economically at all, we still have enormously high growth. So you have an oil-rich country that doesn't generate enough electricity for its people and has either people with no modern energy sources or endemic power cuts that isn't currently able to provide an adequate standard of living, not able to provide education for women. Many of the things that we know cut family size quite quickly. So we need a process of economic development in the poorest areas that will address these population challenges quite quickly.
I'm struck by your invocation of the need for a new growth model. I want to suggest a provocation. One of the great consensuses of the 20th century, and it spanned communism, fascism, liberalism, neoliberalism, welfare statism, all of it, was the consensus that growth was the absolute imperative. Growth at all costs. The debate in the 20th century, the political debate, the great political debate, was about how to achieve growth. What everybody agreed was that growth had to be achieved. In a sense, the ecological, environmental, energy crisis that we have today is the fruit of the fact that everybody agreed that we were going to have growth at all costs. Now, you suggested that we need to have a new growth model. I would submit that perhaps it's not growth that we need, but we need to figure out how to have a political accommodation that doesn't involve growth. The fact is, every single political coalition of the last 75 years has been predicated on the idea of growing the economy as the solution to every kind of other political problem, specifically to avoid the problems of redistribution and fascism, which were posed as solutions to those problems in the 1920s. And I don't know whether we have an actual idea about how to even think about the economy absent growth. The concept of the economy was invented in the 1930s. If you look, the term the economy did not exist prior to the invention of Keynesianism. And the invention of the economy is also coincident with the coming to worship growth as a concept. And I wonder whether we can even think of moving past a growth model altogether, because it seems to me that it's very difficult to imagine how, whether we're talking about 850 million Nigerians or 850 million still poor Chinese, or the 850 million already rich people living in the North Atlantic, how they can possibly have the kind of life that they want. And I'm just wondering, we posited the notion that there is a growth model. We've asserted that it's a matter of political will and imagination. But is it actually possible to have that?
Okay, John.
It's a central, I'm glad you asked it. It's a central question. It's a question that troubles me as much as any question that arises. I mean, a few observations, but I don't have a clear answer to it. I'll be very honest. First thing is, I yield to nobody in the passion with which I recognize that the standard sort of econometric definition of growth is not a very good way of measuring progress and well-being. I mean, it obviously isn't. In most countries, people who tend mostly to be women who don't have paid employment because they want to spend time bringing up children, it is insulting to argue that what they do, the work they do, than which there is no harder work in existence of rearing children, that is somehow, not countable in a measure of how healthy the economy is. It's ridiculous, and there are millions of other examples you could cite. I think I saw recently, I'm not sure this is a good example, but I think there are something like, I'll give it anyway, 300,000 liposuction operations a year conducted in the United States of America. Now, around each of those operations is a great deal of economic activity, all of which gets factored into the statistics that appear overall in US output. So I think, I could slightly dodge your question and say there's an issue of quality of growth as well as an issue of quantity of growth. But the other thing I would say is that as a political idea, growth remains in a kind of dominant position in most of the major economies, whether we like it or not. And there have been many attempts over more than a generation to change that. And the people who have their hands on the levers on the sort of macroeconomic commanding heights have been rather impervious to those attempts. And growth is still more or less, because it's simple and it's become, it's a cultural and political idea as well as an economic one. And I think the defining feature of the climate problem is not so much what we need to do, it's how quickly we need to do it. We need to be mobilizing investment now on a scale of hundreds of billions, shifting investment a year. And it's going to take some time to build a new consensus about what kind of compass we should use to measure progress. And what we can't afford to do is to say, well, we'll do that, and then when we finish doing that, we'll start to deal with these climate and resource nexus problems. The world is messy, and we've got to do this in a much more, a messier way. That the Chinese have a saying, crossing a river by feeling for stones, and we've sort of got to do a bit of that. What we can't do, and I get attacked a lot by people from the environmental community sometimes for saying this, if you just go around saying that somehow we've got to accept a contraction of our prospects, that the party's over now, and from now on you can't expect the kind of progress, the kind of better prospects for yourself and your children because we've hit the limits. It could be, looking back in 50 years, that turns out to be right. But meantime, very few people are going to vote for it. So it's not going to be very practical politics if you want governments in a position to take decisions that will move you there. I think it's not at all obvious to me that that's the case. I think there is plenty of evidence on the contrary that moving to a much more resource efficient and more resilient development model, if I perhaps use a better word, is full of opportunity and full of prospects to enable people to continue to feel that sense of progress.
Okay.
Good evening, thank you. My question is, I'm going to ask you to either look in the crystal ball or to provide us some insider information here. But how can we expect Paris to be different from Copenhagen or anything before that? Will anybody be bringing anything new to the table, either the emerging economies or Europe?
Okay, so how will Paris be different?
I don't have inside information, but nor do I think this is an exercise in, for a very significant reason, in crystal ball gazing. And the reason is that none of us can afford the detachment of pretending that we're, as it were, astronomers looking down a telescope at events in a distant galaxy and trying to make a forecast for how they will turn out. We all have agency in this. We are part of the choice that is going to be made. And so the question for each one of us is, how do we use the agency that we have? What I would say is that there is no reason to believe at this moment that it's impossible to build the political conditions for a successful event. And you can identify some of the key things that need to be done. We need to build more powerful coalitions of interest between the people who want to drive, to push up ambition in this shift.
But would you accept that we're currently on a lower ambition trajectory than we were 2 years before Copenhagen? Countries rolling back commitments, a lack of political will?
Well, I think the answer to that is complicated because, as I say, you can see the low-carbon economy taking shape in some places. But after Copenhagen, I went round, very quietly went round board members of large multinational companies. I mean, it seems to me this problem boils down to quite a simple thing. It's largely going to be private capital that determines whether we lock ourselves further into a high carbon growth model or manage to escape from it. So the question for those who are trying to negotiate the agreement is, what is the signal that that's going to send into that world of private sector capital allocation? I mean, yes, there's some public finance that's involved in this, and there's a great deal of, but what's the signal? Which really boils down to, are they going to believe the promises that we're making to each other? Now, I went round a lot of people, dozens of people on the boards of companies who make those capital allocation decisions after Copenhagen. And I asked them to tell me, not in public, but in private, in public, of course, they all were standing up and saying, we've got to try harder, we believe in keeping climate change within 2 degrees. The question I asked was, do you think Copenhagen is telling you that this is on or that it's off? Is it going to make more sense to you in your company to invest in a low-carbon future, or does that risk your shareholders throwing you out of a job because you should be continuing to invest capital on the assumption that we will get some kind of modified version of business as usual? Nobody, not a single person over those 6 months of conversations told me that they thought that the message from Copenhagen was this is on. It was at best wait and see, and many of them said, actually, it tells you that their governments are never going to summon the will to do this. That's the problem we need to solve for Paris. We need to work out how to send a very different political message.
But you're quite focused on Paris. How would you react to people who would say, it's UNFCCC is never going to do the business. And maybe it will seal a deal if the deal is done elsewhere. We need to look for different forum. We need to send the signals into the process rather than expecting the signals to come out from the process.
What I'd say is that no treaty in history ever, and this is a treaty with a small t, no treaty has ever been stronger than the political foundation that it rests on. And the problem we've been discussing is that we haven't built the political foundation yet. So you can't then establish an agreement which is at a sufficiently high level of ambition or credibility to those people who are watching with the beady eye. So the challenge then is to build those political conditions. You can't do that on the whole simply through an international negotiation. The feedback mechanisms from the negotiation into your arms and legs domestic politics, in which some really powerful and deeply embedded interests are very engaged, they're just not strong enough. There are moments sometimes when domestic politics moves a bit, and in that period before Copenhagen was very interesting because actually the envelope did shift in a number of major economies before Copenhagen, Brazil, for example. But on the whole, what's possible in negotiations follows the domestic politics rather than leads it. So, but that's not to say that the negotiation is a waste of time, because if you can get yourself a treaty, first of all, you're establishing common purpose. You're still strengthening the forces of high ambition all over the world, but you're also recognizing that this is a common problem that therefore needs a common response. And you're also, as it were, making it possible to minimize the transaction costs in the transition. If you can have common technology standards, for example, you can more quickly establish global single markets in some of the key technologies.
But wouldn't some of this suggest that what we need to do is, strike a deal between China and India, or work on particular sectors, and not attempt to make this a 165-country negotiation?
I think we have to be very careful not to see that as a kind of either-or proposition. I mean, not least coming back to the discussion we had about the most vulnerable countries. I mean, there have been phases in this where people have said, well, really, it's only just a dozen economies, and if you can get those dozen economies around the table, you can sort of crack this. I think, first of all, it's very important not to give anybody the sense that they're being excluded, that they don't have a voice in this. That is storing up problems. And actually, those who would be excluded by such a process tend to be some of the key forces for a higher level of ambition. So it's dangerous to exclude them from that point of view. Does that mean that you shouldn't have other kinds of conversation going on, experimenting with regional cooperation? I mean, the EU, with its 2020 targets, is a very good example of regional effective, I think. I mean, it's got some problems at the moment, but broadly effective regional cooperation. And if you construct that in the right way and get the right relationship with the UN conversation, then they can be mutually reinforcing rather than mutually incompatible.
Thank you. Bear with me, I want to do an exercise with you. And particularly following on the conversation you mentioned, we need a conversation around values and asking some basic questions about who we are. If you look around the world today, say, where do you find that kind of language debate at the very high level of the political agenda? And you find it in China. And last week, actually, the communique of the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress in China stated clearly something, sort of elements around this sort of a value issue, as well as fundamental issues about who we are. Languages like, ecological boundary, red line. Languages like ecological civilization. Languages about, pricing of the natural resources, things like that. If I may put you on the spot, and internationally, we all know, actually, lack of leadership in the climate change arena is a big, big challenge today. There are many stakeholders around the world looking into China saying, you should lead. Not only say size of your economy, your rising status, as well as emissions, whatever the angle. So if I may, I put you in the seat of a Chinese foreign minister or Mr. Xie Zhenhua, who is leading the person on climate change issues. With this sort of thinking at the very high level, about the value, about, fundamental issues, about civilization, about who we are, how would you, whatever that, you would be able to bring others with you to demonstrate the leadership from China with that sort of thinking? It would be great, actually, to see how you play that out. Thank you.
Thought you were about to offer me a job for that. Should I take that?
Yes,
yeah. Gosh, I mean, just a few brush strokes, really. I always used to think, when I was involved in the climate negotiations more than I am now, or actually in other roles, I used to think, if I can't explain what I'm doing to my grandmother or to somebody that I meet on the street, then I'm not doing a very good job. Because you've got to bring peoples with you. If you're talking about, you can't do transformation by stealth. You can't do it under the radar. Transformation affects everybody's lives, and climate change actually is going to affect, climate change and the response to it will affect everybody. So we have to somehow find a way of communicating, which is both speaking and listening, that draws everybody into a kind of shared way of engaging, not intellectually so much as emotionally, with what this means for us and where we're going. And we have to do that in every society, really, if we're going to play a constructive role in the international conversation. I applaud the shift which has happened in what you might call know better than me, so it sounds a bit presumptuous for me to say it, but the Chinese establishment, the Chinese elites, if you like, I see more of a recognition there than I see, to be brutally honest, in our own elite in the UK, in the need for something which is quite fundamentally different to the model which actually in China's case has brought quite a lot of success, extraordinary success over the last 1 or 2 generations, but a recognition that now is the time to build something very different. It's not just about low carbon, by the way, you know, shifting towards consumption in the structure of the economy. So building that common language and looking inward into your own country in order to be more effective in the external conversation. I think another thing, none of these is a complete answer to your question. I think we've rather, I'm going to say this very carefully because I know that I may be a weaponized mathematician, but there are even more weaponized economists in this room today. So I don't want to be misunderstood. But we've rather surrendered too easily to a certain kind of economics notion that defines the climate problem as, if you like, a collective action problem, is the phrase used. And a collective action problem, when you boil down to it, essentially is a burden-sharing problem. It forces you to focus most of your imagination on the question of the burdens, the costs of making the shift. Now, there are costs. I'm not trying to deny that there are costs. If you want to burn coal without carbon capture and storage, it's going to be cheaper than burning it with carbon capture and storage in a macroeconomic sense. But at the same time, there are enormous benefits as well in the transition. An example that perhaps is cogent in this region, I think there have been something like 11 or 12 oil price shocks over the last 60 years in the global economy. All but one of them has been followed quite soon afterwards by a global recession. Now, the idea that building a model which has more resilience against those kind of shocks, which is therefore less dependent on that particular resource, that's a benefit for the economy and for people's lives. And I think bringing to life the positive side of this is also a big opportunity. I don't have a complete answer to your question because I think the answer varies society by society. And it starts with the intent. You have to have the intent. And I see some countries where the intent is stronger than in other countries at the moment. That's part of the problem.
But listening to you tonight, talking about Copenhagen, one would think that it was an abject failure. Governments didn't believe in it, and the private sector didn't believe in it. But at the end of the day, the summit did produce an accord, and it did produce a voluntary register where more than 100 governments registered commitments that most of them actually have delivered on since. And you mentioned that, for example, renewable energy, and especially solar, but also wind, has come down dramatically in price. So something also seems to have gone right in Copenhagen, and since then, even with everybody who didn't believe in it. So I guess my question is twofold. How do you explain that things did go somehow right after all? And number two, what does the Paris Agreement look like in your mind, given your experience?
Thank you. All of my experience is, even though I now have the luxury of not being sort of behind a government flag, screams at me in response to the second question that I shouldn't at this stage be committing myself too much to what exactly it looks like, but I will answer that point. I mean, the first, it's probably not productive to go too far into a kind of deconstruction of the consequences of Copenhagen and how much it was the Copenhagen Accord that has driven the progress down the cost curve of renewable energy technologies and how much other forces have been at work. And I think, beyond a certain point, it's impossible to deconstruct. But I think you could say that in policy terms, Copenhagen was productive to an extent, but in political terms, it wasn't. And that's just, if you just look at the way those communities who don't have a direct connection with the policy processes that flow from the Copenhagen Accord, it didn't do anything, it seems to me, to give them confidence that governments are on top of this. or will be anytime soon. Quite the contrary, it rather sort of created a sense of desperation among those young people that I talked about. And that's a political challenge that, whatever the reason for it, we now need, I think, to address. On the second question, I think, first of all, it's important to understand the function that whatever emerges from this next cycle needs to fulfill. And I've tried to articulate a view about that, which is that it needs to convince the world of private capital allocation that governments are now serious about this, that policy frameworks at a level of ambition consistent with giving ourselves a fighting chance of keeping climate change within 2 degrees are now going to happen, that they believe those promises, so that increasingly it will make sense to them to invest in that direction, which will start to make it, as it were, a self-fulfilling prophecy. They can do it, by the way. If you talk privately to them, they say, well, we just need to know what the policy ambition is going to be, because we can deliver either future for you, with some exceptions. But so that's a point about the function. But I think another point for negotiators is to understand something very important at this moment, which is that if you're sitting inside a government, whether as a minister or a civil servant, and you make a promise in good faith, you tend to think that that promise is going to be fulfilled. It's sort of natural. It's hard for you to kind of accommodate, unless you are not an honorable person. And nearly everybody in that world, I even go so far as to say everybody in that world, I'm not going to accuse anybody of being a dishonorable person. But you need a lot of emotional intelligence at a moment like this, because pretty much everybody else is really quite cynical about promises made by politicians and by governments. They don't all assume that promises are all inevitably going to be broken, but they want more than just words if they're going to believe in them. So I think one of the issues we need to build a conversation. It's not just about the dry issue of the nature of the size, the scale of the commitments and the legal nature of the commitments, although they matter. It's about the way we get there, the political quality of the conversation we build. We need to end up with credible commitments that people will believe and therefore act on. It's a technical question, but the legal basis of that then becomes very important. Because if people aren't willing to make commitments that are in a sense legally binding, then people will say, well, why should we believe them if they weren't willing to sort of bind themselves? That's a key. It's going to be a key issue, I think, over the next couple of years. One of many. But I'm not going to try and design the architecture for the agreement beyond that.
You see, the question that's been, I think, not just me thinking about it, since you have mentioned September 11, one thing about September 11 that after that date, we have seen a very working coalition with complete determination, countries of both sides of what used to be Berlin Wall. They came together, they were very serious, very determined, and we found like new rules were forced on everybody. For example, extra security at the airports and everything. Maybe these were not very good for some economies, but things were put in place and were forced with complete seriousness. Why isn't the same? And of course, government were taking the lead in that, not the private sector for sure. Why isn't the same can be put together with the same determination into why, like using arena or within Paris? For example, where you say no more fishing at that spot, done, point, no more fishing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the question is that, we had a terrorist incident and then countries came together and they changed an enormous amount of things. They spent a lot of money often on the wrong things. Why can't we do that about a problem that's so much more serious?
First of all, it's a brilliant question. And I don't, in some ways, just the amount of taxpayers' money which has been invested since then in, if you like, the response to 9/11, is probably more averaged over that time than you would need to leverage private capital as fast as you want to leverage it towards a low-carbon economy. And yet it sort of flowed quite, and there's a really interesting question. Why can you do it in that sphere and not this sphere? I don't have a full answer, but just one observation from my own experience. And when I was talking about the growth model, this is part of what I meant. There is a kind of not always very deeply examined consensus that emerged over the last generation or so in a number of the major economies. And I'm not criticizing, if you like, the scholarly world of economics when I say this. I'm really thinking about economic policy advisors and decision makers in government. There's a kind of assumption that, on the whole, governments should try and intervene as little as possible in the economy. And sometimes that's interpreted in a rather crude way. Anybody who comes along suggesting more intervention is given short thrift among the people whose voices really matter in shaping our responses. Now, you can build a low-carbon future, but you can't build a low-carbon future without a high degree of intervention. I'm not talking about big government. I'm certainly not talking about a reversion to kind of central planning and its kind of failed forms of the past. I think I'm talking about smart government, and how do you do that in a way which harnesses the power of markets to enable you to make the shift as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But you can't do it without, as it were, channeling that market energy to this outcome rather than that outcome. And that consensus has been quite deeply embedded across economic policy establishments all over the world. And I've seen in the British government again and again and again, when we've faced key choices in our own progress along this path, the resistance from those who are just completely hostile to the idea of that degree of intervention has been impossible to overstate. And it's not been analytical, it's been cultural and visceral. And so part of building a new growth model is actually getting a bit more. It was quite interesting that the Financial Times had an editorial the other day calling for more humility in the economics profession in recognition of what's happened in 2008 and subsequently. And I'm not going to get into whether the economics as an academic discipline has enough humility. But I do think that in governments, where the rubber hits the road in big strategic macroeconomic decisions, there is a need for a willingness to go back to fundamentals and focus on smart intervention rather than no intervention. That's part of the answer to your problem, I think.
I come from Beijing and a professor at Chinese University. I fully agree with what you said in the beginning of your talk. That is, the application of any universal values must meet the local and national, experience, tradition, condition, and requirement. And I want to extend this logic to China's situation, China's commitment to address the global climate change. For China, I don't think that the decisive factor is some abstract the value or new identity as a citizen of the global village and so on and so on. Of course, this kind of ideas and the liberal international concept have impact upon the minds of Chinese leaders and the Chinese government. But at first, I think that more important consideration is China's diplomatic interests. At first, that because addressing climate change become a theme of the world opinion. So at first, the Chinese leaders think that if we not do something, and Chinese diplomatic interests and influence and prestige will be reduced. But decisive factor, especially in recent years, is that the Chinese leaders and government know that for China, we must to make much greater contribution to this climate change issue. Because in China, the issue of addressing climate change is only a part of the improve or prevent deterioration of the environment in China, not first of all in world. So they know that more and more, and they determine more and more to prevent the oil, the water, the land, the air become deteriorating and to damaging seriously the prospect of sustainable development in China, and even to damage social stability. And so this kind of the commitment to make China become more clear and more, less poisoned is a decisive driving force. So my question is that, and under this pressure to make China become environmentally healthier, and rather than make the world situation become much better, do you think that could it provide sufficient driving force to make China to increase contribution to world cause of addressing climate change? My answer, of course, yes.
Short answer, yes, I agree with you. But a couple of observations, if I may. I mean, the definition of interests in any society is primarily always going to come from inside that society. Nobody can go to the other side of the world as a diplomat or a politician and wag a finger and say, that's in your interest. You shouldn't see that as your interest. I mean, they can say it, but it's not going to get them very far. There was the famous phrase, responsible stakeholder, that was applied to China some years ago, appealed to China to be a responsible stakeholder. Well, first of all, it seemed to me when I heard that, no society, no government, no leadership anywhere is going to go around the world and say, well, actually, we want to be an irresponsible stakeholder. So it was kind of a trivial thing. But secondly, I think it lacked what you might call emotional intelligence, because it sort of implied that it was for other people to make judgments about what was responsible and what wasn't. And I didn't think that was helpful in building the kind of conversation with China that actually could help to lead us towards, if you like, an alignment between how we all see our interests. That's not to say that international conversations are unimportant. I think they're hugely important, including conversations like this, because the reality is we often talk about interests as if they're really clear and hard-edged and easy to define. But actually, all interests are really perceived interests. They're constructions. And the forces that lead us to identify this interest rather than that interest are quite fluid forces. And in this particular moment in history, there's a degree of confusion everywhere about exactly how to articulate our interests. And it's precisely when there's a degree of confusion that I think the one thing you can be clear about is we all have an interest in talking more to each other and listening more to each other, because then we might come out. There's one other thing I would say about China, if I may, like just one more minute, because I think there are some cultural questions which are quite relevant here. And I say this as somebody who's been lucky enough over my professional lifetime to have quite a lot of engagement. I lived in China in the early 1980s, for example. I think that for reasons of history and culture, there's perhaps a little bit more affinity in China than there is in our much more reductionist American and European views of the world, to think about systems as a whole and to ask what are the conditions that are necessary in order for that system to flourish. There's a more holistic, systemic kind of cultural reflex. We, as a kind of consequence of what we call now the Enlightenment that we went through, the Enlightenment was quite a reductionist process. And I think we have, in a way, we have left the Enlightenment incomplete, because what we now need to do is to apply the reason, the gift of reason that was unleashed in the Enlightenment, to understanding that you can understand each element as well as you can, but you can never understand the whole system by looking at the elements. So one thing that I would favor is, on the part of my own society, listening quite deeply to that, as it were, wisdom from Chinese culture. And there is listening in the other direction to be done as well. But I hope that is a helpful response to your point.
Thank you for this great discussion. I have a lot of bullet points. I'm going to try to make this quick. One question I have that's been, I think about this a lot is solar. The amount of energy we can get from the sun in seconds, the amount that hits the earth in seconds produces enough energy for, I saw numbers, for like the world for a year or something within like 3 seconds. Anyway, this kind of goes along with his question about how come something can't be put in place? After a big hurricane, they change building codes. I remember a big hurricane in Florida, Hurricane Andrew. After that, they changed the building codes on the roofs. Why can't they add something as simple as, and the government, building it into the building codes that solar and wind, and I don't expect it to take up all their energy, but a little bit, and over a big picture, instead of trying to do it commercially at these huge wind farms and solar farms and stuff, do it on an individual basis per house.
Yeah.
And if each house can get 10% of its energy from solar on the big scale, that produces a lot, reduces a lot less carbon.
John, react to that quick.
Quickly, you've got to do the politics. What you can do in terms of technology is not necessarily the same as what you can do politically. Yes, of course you can do that. But actually in the UK, we have relaxed our building standards, not more in the area of energy efficiency over the last few years, actually because of that idea that was big government and it needs to get out of the way. That sort of ideological view just became so strong in the current government that we've gone in the wrong direction. Of course we can do those things, and we have to summon the will to do them and to do them together.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Jakob Hartwig. I'm a student at NYU Abu Dhabi, and you were talking about government interventions, and I was wondering, how do you see the future of market mechanism like the European trading mechanism or the clean development mechanism in the context of the fundamental criticism we experience in the context of that very often? Thank you.
Again, treading slightly carefully what I say about economics, I mean, I think that putting a price on carbon, whether we do it by emissions trading or carbon taxes, is obviously a good thing to do, although there's some very fundamental problems about how you set the price. It's determined in emissions trading by the amount of scarcity that you build in, but what's the right amount of scarcity to build in? But I think certainly when we were setting up the European emissions trading scheme, there were too many people who just thought, well, we just get the scheme running, and then we can stand back and it will just do everything we need to do. And what they didn't understand, even the sort of theoretical basis for that, is those kind of mechanisms can work, they can help you at the margin. They can give you incremental support, but they're not transformational. You can't drive a shift from hydrocarbon-fueled transport to electric transport on the basis of putting a price on carbon alone. It can help, but you need to do other things as well. In a sense, I was quite struck by the number of people in the City of London who started to say to me, look, you don't understand. It's not the price of carbon that really matters here. It's the cost of capital for low-carbon infrastructure investment. And that's not wrong. That's why in the UK we now have something called a Green Investment Bank, whose job is to drive down the cost of capital, partly by de-risking, by reducing the perceived political risk in that. So part of it, it's useful, but only as part of a portfolio, and it's not one of the more transformational pieces in the portfolio, in my view, at the moment.
So just to close, John, I mean, we know that climate change is already happening, and we know it's already having an impact on people's lives. But if you've talked about young people, if you're 20 or 25 or 30 today, you know that in your lifetime, you are going to be living in a very, very different world. So just to close, can you say how it is you're inspiring those people to build a different politics, to build towards this transformation?
I wouldn't remotely claim to be inspiring anybody. I just do my best to express what I think and to listen to what others think. But inspiration really comes from within. I think what worries me about that generation is that at the moment many of them have got so little confidence in the establishments that they see, the political and media and business and other kinds of that they've sort of turned their backs. In Britain, many people, and particularly young people, now make no distinction between any of the major parties. They just view them as slightly marginally different versions of basically the same thing. And that's worrying. If somehow we can change that situation so that you can induce a turning back to politics, a re-engagement, but a re-engagement on a basis of a real conversation about how we build something very different, then you will be mobilizing political energy from that constituency. And I think there's a clue there to what we need to do more widely. There are plenty of constituencies, I suppose you'd call them, from which a higher level of political energy is available, or a political impulse for a higher level of ambition is available. But they tend to be disaggregated. They're not expressing themselves coherently as a kind of source of high ambition. Another very good example is cities. There is increasing recognition around the world in cities that climate change is only a bad thing for cities. It's a source of potential insecurity and instability in cities, and an awareness one by one among city leaderships that cities really do need a successful response to climate change. But again, although they sometimes send representatives to sit round the table of cities getting together, that's talking, that's not really expressing themselves. And I think part of the challenge now is how do we build coalitions of interest that bring together the different forces that have an interest in going beyond the status quo, going beyond business as usual, and challenging that incumbency power. In any process of change, you start off in a process of change, first of all, at the risk of getting myself thrown out, to use language which really comes from Marxism originally. This is a political struggle. It's a political struggle between forces of change and forces of incumbency at its fundamental level. And the forces of incumbency always start off in the strongest position because they're the incumbents. So how do you empower and bring together and strengthen together the forces of change, it seems to me, the key question. And young people are one of the main sort of ingredients in any strategy for doing that, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed that. And I do beg you to stay and talk and network for the reception afterwards. I'd also like to thank the team here at NYU Abu Dhabi for the work that they've done for this event and more broadly bringing us over for the seminar as a whole. And most of all, obviously, I'd like to thank John for his time and for his insights this evening. So thank you very much.